From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Tomoko Steen. I'm a research specialist here at the Library of Congress. Today's talk is sponsored by Science, Technology, and Business Division of the Library of Congress. And today's speaker, Dr. Strater, is going to talk about one of the hot topic now in the malaria, and give you some historical perspective. The Japanese often said, by visiting old, you're learning something new. And this is one of the good example of the epidemiological studies is always like this. And by visiting some of the flu epidemics in 1918, and we find something new. So this is a malaria this time. I also want to mention Library of Congress Science, Technology, and Business Division has a technical report section, and we have wonderful collection of the World War II scientific research document, including OSRD, and Office of Science, Scientific Research and Development collection is the one of the treasure mine, and we received it 1946, right after the war, before the document was actually unclassified. So it is an almost complete collection and not widely known outside of the world. So, please pass the word. We have excellent collections and visit us. Head of the collection, Dr. Lawrence Marcus mentioned that one of these reports, it's a Division 6 report, is about malaria, and the opening chapter says U.S. need to do some research on malaria synthetic drugs because Japanese attacked all the places producing quinine. So that was an interesting quote I heard. Okay, before going to further outside stories, I should introduce the speaker. Dr. Leo Strater, he currently is a historian at the Naval Research Laboratory, and he manages the historical document within the country as well as overseas oral history programs. And he has been in all different places, and we were just talking about that he was in Berlin, Germany, at Max Planck, the one of the prestigious Institute of History of Science. And he was also director at the National Institute of Health, and he's also held a position at the Chemical Heritage Foundation, where he got a lot of document from the UPenn and possibly other institutes around the Philly. Dr. Strater has an undergraduate degree from Brandeis and a master's degree at Stanford University, both in chemistry. And he also has master's and PhD from Princeton University. So today's topic is the war and the malaria and the war, a U.S. anti-malarial program in World War II. This is same with his book title. And several of my colleagues who work on the malaria at the NIH and Johns Hopkins have read this book, and they were really saying how wonderful that book was, because have the combination of the great scientific background at the same time historical sensitivity. So before further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Strater.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today to speak. As Tomoko said, I'm going to talk today about my last big project, which was on malaria. I'm not speaking as an NRL employee today. This is largely out of my book, which I guess will be available after the talk. I want to place the U.S. Antimalarial program in the context of other wartime research programs. Obviously, the big one in that category is the Manhattan Project, but there are others, the radar program, synthetic rubber, and penicillin being the most similar to the antimalarial program in that it's also biomedical in nature, but a much more, I would argue, a much more narrowly focused development program and not a broad-ranging research program like the antimalarial program was, which both developed specific drugs for malaria but also did a lot of biochemistry and biological and basic research. The other thing about this list is, except for my book, the antimalarial program is, I think, the least well-treated, or maybe including my book, it's the least well-treated of these research programs from a historical perspective. What I want to say about biomedicine during the war is, first of all, we speak of a pre-war period and a post-war period, and often in that way of thinking, the war becomes a single point on a timeline, and I want to give it some extent, that it lasted for years, that there was a process, that there was evolution. For today's talk, I'll arguably say we'll date it from 1939 to 1946. You could push back that first date. Obviously, throughout the 30s, there was a lot of concern with war. There was already conflict in Asia. There was expansionism of the National Socialists in Germany and Europe. So you could push that back if you wanted, but 39 I think is good for us today. And I push it to 46, although the war ended in 45, it took at least a year to wind down or wind up those wartime research programs. So I want to expand that out, that idea in time. And I also want to suggest with my little cartoon and my arrows that I so gracefully did, that different aspects of biomedicine are going to change in different ways, that not everything just happens in lockstep. And it's a pretty messy process, so that's what I'm going to describe a bit today. Before I move on, I have a mixed audience here today. I just want to say a little bit about what is malaria. It's a protozoan parasite. It's transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes. As a parasite, it's much larger and more complicated than a bacterium. It has a multi-stage life cycle in 2 different hosts. And beyond that, it's even more complicated because it's not even a single disease. There are 4 major species that affect human beings: falciparum, vivax, malariae, and ovale. Mostly we're going to talk today, think about just falciparum and vivax. I think today falciparum is probably the most pertinent disease studied in this complex. I think probably for World War II, vivax was equally important, if not more so. Falciparum is a much more deadly disease, but from people I know who've had vivax, evidently it makes you wish you were dead, even if it doesn't kill you. All of these are characterized by periodic fevers, recurring fever every night, every other night, or every 3rd night. And from that kind of description of the symptoms, we believe malaria to be an ancient disease going back in the medical literature for thousands of years. Obviously, a host of other complications and the risk of death. Here's a little cartoon just to give you an idea about how complicated a life cycle this is, what we're dealing with here. We'll start on the upper left with the Anopheles mosquito biting your shoulder in her saliva, and it's a female mosquito. Only the females bite. They use the blood to nourish their eggs. In her saliva comes the first form of the parasite we're going to see, the sporozoite. Makes its way into your bloodstream and quickly to the liver. There, in the liver stage, it reproduces several orders of magnitude, eventually emerging into the bloodstream, and you get this little cycle on the center. I can use my pointer. This little asexual reproduction cycle in the bloodstream, very destructive. Each time it infects a cell, it reproduces in there by, say, another order of magnitude, destroys that cell, and a lot of the symptoms are associated with that destruction of the red blood cells. At a certain point, some of these merozoites don't continue that asexual cycle. They break off into a sexual reproductive cycle down here with female and male gametocytes. These circulate in the bloodstream, and it's these that are infectious to the mosquito. Another mosquito comes, bites you there on your hip, ingests these, and inside the mosquito the sexual reproduction takes place, and the progeny of these make their way through the mosquito gut and through the mosquito's body, and as sporozoites make their way into her salivary glands, and thus we have another infectious mosquito and the cycle is complete. It seems very complicated, but it seems to be also very efficient and effective for this organism. Before I move on to history, I just want to remind everyone that malaria remains a major threat to human beings. Hundreds of millions of cases annually, hundreds of thousands of deaths annually, and most of those are children under the age of 6 in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's still a major public health threat. Malaria before the war, just a quick overview for the world and the United States. Here's a distribution map for malaria circa 1940. You'll see in the left-hand side, you can see that it's still a serious disease in the United States. And you can also see that it extends well up into the temperate zones, both north and south. A comparable distribution today would be more compressed to the tropics, but disease still impacts roughly a third of the human population. In the United States, at the time we're talking about, this is data, you can even see the whole thing. This is data from 1920 to 1946, and you can see an overall decline with some ups and downs, but a decline both in cases and in deaths in the United States. There's a small blip there. The trend line is the dashed line, and it does continue down. That up curve is caused by cases coming in from abroad during the war. But in general, disease, though seriously in decline also. And why the decline in malaria? There's a number of reasons. Margaret Humphreys has a really lovely book, Malaria, Race, and Poverty in the United States, I believe it's called. Oops, come back. And her argument, it largely has to do with housing and migration and poverty reduction, that if you live in a tighter house, if you have a better diet, if you're generally more healthy, there's less of an impact on malaria. And certainly in this country we did see, for instance, in the Great Migration, a lot of people moving from very poor housing in malarial areas into better housing in less malarial areas, and that really drove down those numbers. You can also reduce malaria by killing the mosquitoes that carry it directly with insecticides like DDT, which is a big part of malaria's history, but not something we're talking about today. And drainage. You can remove the water in which your local anopheles breed and reduce incidence that way. And even before it was known that malaria was carried by mosquitoes, the disease was associated with marshes and wetlands. Indeed, its name, malaria, the bad air of these wet places, was associated with the disease, and drainage was used to control the disease even before the mosquito vectors had been identified. And of course, you can kill the parasites directly in the body with drugs, and that's what we're focused on here today. Before 1924, drugs for malaria really meant quinine. Quinine is a natural drug, that is, it occurs naturally in the bark of the cinchona tree. It was isolated as a pure chemical compound for the first time in the early 19th century in France. The bark, of course, was known for a couple of hundred years before that, going back into the 17th century, certainly known in Europe and America as a medicine for malaria. This is the natural range of the cinchona tree, whose bark was used, and in the 17th century, most of this geographical area was all the colonial province of the Spanish Empire of Peru. So it was largely controlled by the Spanish Empire, and the bark was collected in the wild, so it was not an agricultural product. During the 19th century, several imperial endeavors were undertaken to control this commodity, to move this tree to plantations in various parts of the tropics. And the most successful by far were the Dutch, who took high-quality trees to Java, set up large plantations there, and by the period we're talking about, the early 20th century, the Dutch had essentially a global monopoly on quinine, producing more than 90% of the world's supply. This is what is in today Indonesia. And we'll come back to Java in a minute. Because of this control of quinine, many people had an interest in replacing it, whether it was the Spanish Empire or the Dutch Empire that controlled it. If you were outside of that, you were limited in your access to quinine. Also, quinine's not a great drug. It has a lot of side effects. It doesn't work against all of the life stages of the parasite. And so there was a real interest in that, and of course there was a pushback from the people controlling the supply of quinine. This is a piece of propaganda from the quinine monopoly, arguing that the natural drug is better than the synthetics, and here you can even see some workers in Java processing the bark. So where did this interest in replacing quinine take us? Let's talk about drug development then in the interwar period, that is before the period we're focused on today, the wartime. This is largely a German story for a couple of reasons. The Germans had a need in that they, like other combatants in World War I, had suffered greatly from malaria in the field, but they also had a strength in that much of the fine chemicals, the dye industry, and the pharmaceutical industry was centered in Germany in this period. And so they looked into this problem, and they had a big breakthrough in the 20s when Wilhelm Rohl at Bayer developed an animal model for screening antimalarial compounds. This was a bird model, so it wasn't human malaria and it wasn't human beings. It was avian malaria in birds, but still a pretty good initial screen for antimalarial activity, and very quickly, drawing on the chemical expertise, their catalog of compounds they had at Bayer, they developed plasmachine, the first synthetic antimalarial drug, and then in 1932 they synthesized atabrine. This is plasmachine, an interesting and good drug, simpler compound than quinine, and one you can make in the laboratory fairly readily. This is atabrine, which coincidentally is just about this color that I've drawn it in. A bright yellow compound comes directly out of one of their dye programs. Again, a decent drug. The color was always an issue with this drug. If you take too much of it, it can dye your skin and so on. But a very important drug for World War II, also atabrine. We'll be back to that. This is a piece of marketing material from Bayer. It's in German and Latin, but I think we'll get by. Basically, this is illustrating the differential capability of the two drugs, plasmachine and atabrine. The ability to kill the parasite is given by the rays projecting upward and downward. So you can see that plasmachine, for example, works very well against the gametocytes in each of these kinds of malaria. And these, again, this is Vivax, this is falciparum, and this is Malariae. And atabrine works differentially. Now, I point this out because they could develop very nice structure-activity relationships. That is, a certain compound has a certain set of activities against certain aspects of the parasite, but at this time and later on even, they had no idea of the mode of action of the drug. So you could do rational work, but you couldn't base it on a basic biochemical understanding. Before we move out of the German program, I want to mention one more drug. This is chloroquine. Was made first at Bayer in 1934, and due to some bad data they got in human toxicity data, they dropped this drug at that time. But remember it, we're going to come back to it. It's going to have a rebirth. So let's talk about 1939. What was the state of the art at this time? We have the National Research Council based here in DC, quasi-governmental organization established by the federal government to provide scientific and engineering advice to the federal government. The National Research Council was looking for timely topics that should be investigated, and they chose chemotherapy of malaria, the drug developments for malaria, as a focal area. Then what were the technical, what were the scientific, what were the resources at hand, what was the state of the art? On the technical side, they had a good clinical knowledge of the course of the disease. They had the natural drug, quinine. They had the new synthetic drugs. They had some promising animal models. On the scientific side, they knew most of the parasite's life cycle. They didn't know about the liver stage. They knew that the parasite was sequestered somewhere in the body, but they didn't know where between the bite and when it appeared in the bloodstream. They had some of the beginnings of an immunological understanding of the disease, and they knew nothing about the mechanism of action of any of these drugs. Organizationally, they could draw on the Bayer program, which was well known and well established, and they could draw on the Rockefeller Foundation, which in the interwar period was the big funder of public health research in malaria, and in fact had a couple of laboratories of their own, were not on a large scale, but where they did very high quality biomedical research on malaria. And of course, as the National Research Council, they could look around at their committees, at their peers, largely academic, and look for resources there. So now, on to the U.S. wartime program. I'm going to take you through some key dates, some issues about its organization, how it operated and the problems it faced, and then focusing more on its accomplishments and the long-term legacy with regard to biomedicine in the 20th century. As I said, in 1939, the Committee on Chemotherapy, and I'm using chemotherapy here in the way they used it then. Nowadays, we almost exclusively use chemotherapy to refer to drugs dealing with cancer, but back then it was the use of any chemical compound to address a disease issue. And they as I said, very quickly focused in on malaria. 1939 was a good year to do that. War and disease often went hand in hand, and war was looming. By 1941, the federal government had gotten directly into the game. Money began to flow from the federal government. The Committee on Medical Research was set up as part of the OSRD. These are the kinds of records that Tomoko was referring to at the opening. By 43, there was more of a need for control, both because there was a lot of money flowing into this and also because the program was growing. I'm going to talk more about that. So they set up a board for the coordination, which was really a federal body in more of a sense than the NRC was. And finally, before war's end in 1945, they set up Division 6, the Malaria Division of the National Defense Research Committee, which really meant the government had taken control of all this malaria research. Now, how was it organized? That's a trick question because it's a very complicated thing, and I don't want to run you through a million different committees and panels that changed and evolved over time and merged. But I would argue this, that what went on in those first few years doesn't suggest at all that the organizational infrastructure for large-scale, multi-center, cooperative research was in place prior to U.S. entry in World War II. So they really had to build all this up from nothing. And to describe that for you, I'm going to invoke Bill Clark, who was a chemistry professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He had worked in government laboratories. He was a chair of several of the pertinent committees at the National Research Council, and he was a proponent of an old-style, gentlemanly way of doing science. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but first I want you to see how this is one of his, he was deeply involved in this. This is 44, so the board is already in place. The original of this even has color pencil in it. But this is pretty far along in the organizational process, and they were still looking like this. Of course, after the war, they could look back and say, well, this is a very well-organized top-down system, and there it is. There's logical panels, there's chairs, it's all set. But it wasn't really like that, and Clark has a great metaphor that avoids having to detail all these committees, the metaphor of the kaleidoscope. The changes in organization were sufficiently kaleidoscopic to give the impression of an unstable pattern. Indeed, a person concerned only with the superficial aspects of organization might be tempted to use the record in support of the contention that a similar emergency in the future had best be handled by a predetermined body in accordance with a preformed plan. But this would be to misread the record. It is a record of research in which organizational matters were continually adjusted to meet the demands of scientific advances. This aspect of the record deserves greater emphasis. So it was very much a ground up. It was very much things changed as something was learned, as a new question arose. They reorganized to address those changes. At the same time, I would argue it wasn't just this ground up, intellectually driven model that he's suggesting here. There's also more and more pressure from the top to organize it, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The nature and problems of the program, these are 4 categories that overlap some, but I think they give you a nice cross-section of what it was all about. The national emergency, things were urgent. The huge expansion, the dispersion of the program at the same time they were trying to control it, centralization and dispersion, confidentiality with 2 meanings here I'll go into in a moment, and government bureaucracy, that is the urge of, well, here we are, the urge of large-scale government to want to control and regulate its own activities. Let's start with national emergency. War had begun in parts of the world. We were in the war by the end of 41. Troops were headed to malarial areas. That's the South Pacific, that's North Africa, that's Southern Europe, many different places. And this is a quote from an early committee meeting. Colonel Simmons was the Army rep from the Army Surgeon General's office on the committee, later General Simmons. And basically what he's saying here is what the military needs is a field prophylactic. That is a drug. It doesn't have to be a great drug. It doesn't have to be a good treatment. They need a drug that will keep a Marine or a soldier functioning in a malarial area, that will suppress enough symptoms, have few enough side effects, that this person can continue to function and fight. So one of the first things they had to do in order to make that happen was find a drug, and the one they immediately went to was Atabrine. This is a drug that's been on the market for about a decade at this point, but drug regulation then was not what it is today, whatever that is, but not what it is today. And so the protocols for its use and even the determining the quality of the supply, all these were open questions. Even the kinds of things we take for granted when we're doing clinical pharmacology today, like the ability to measure the levels of a drug in blood or urine, they had to work all that out for this drug. None of this was known. And they worked all that up and did all that in very short order. In addition to that, they established this one drug, then they moved on to search for new drugs. So they propagated various animal models, mostly avian, but other ones creeping in, and set up a large-scale screening program, that is, and they also solicited compounds from laboratories around the country and even allied nations, so an international effort to collect all kinds of things and test them. And then based on what they were finding, they went on to contract with chemists at various universities to synthesize new compounds to test based on their findings. So very large scale, rapidly expanding. The other driver for national emergency was alluded to in the introduction. The Japanese, in early December of 1941, attacked Pearl Harbor and Singapore, the bases respectively for the U.S. Pacific and the British fleets, and they did this to cover their advance through Southeast Asia, where they were headed to, of all places, Java. And they weren't there for the cinchona trees, they were there for the oil. Java had rich oil fields, and the Japanese had recently been cut off largely from international oil supplies by an embargo imposed by the U.S. Because of their activities in China. So even if we'd wanted to use quinine, the Allies were, by early 42, cut off from the supply of quinine. And just a final way to sort of think about what the motivations were. This is another Bill Clark quote. "My entire policy has been founded on the faith that we all have our eyes fixed on the fellow in the foxhole with malaria in his blood." So there was a certain altruism based on a shared sense of duty across many sectors of society that really motivated this. That was part of the national emergency as a shaping context for the program. Centralization and dispersion next. As I said, a large program, growing, new areas constantly being thought up to go into. So very important to try to minimize duplication, maximize the output, provide some coordination, and also locate, enroll, and enroll expertise in many different laboratories, private sector, public laboratories, and also universities, and also then protect those laboratories from the draft, so to maintain the expert personnel you'd need for this. Confidentiality. As I said, I mean this in two ways. In a little way, I mean it the way we often use it now in the government. That is, confidential information is something you don't share in order to protect national security. But in this case, the most important use of confidentiality was protecting intellectual property. As I said, they had solicited compounds from all over. Many of these came from commercial firms, and the firms might even have an interest in malaria drugs, so they might have an interest in those compounds that they were sharing because of the national emergency. But more important to most of the companies like DuPont and so on, who shared a lot of material with the program, was that their competitors wouldn't see an entire list of all of the compounds in their chemical library that they were providing to this free of charge to this government program. They didn't want to share that kind of proprietary information. And Clark, in his old school way of doing it, assured them, based on his personal integrity and his handshake, in many cases literally his handshake, that he would protect this information. And finally, confidential in the traditional sense of, well, these are from the chemical warfare program, so we don't want to let these compounds out, or concerns like that. You don't have to read this thing. Mostly I just want to point to Clark's values. This is Clark writing to James Shannon, and James Shannon's going to come back. At this time, Shannon was heading up all of the clinical programs for the antimalarial project. Just the language here, I think I actually missed one of these responsibilities, but responsibility, good discretion, common sense, responsibility. These are the values he's espousing, and what is he up against? He's up against a government bureaucracy that's interested in ownership, interested in getting value for the taxpayers who are paying for all of this. It's not entirely insidious. It's a real and legitimate concern. So the bureaucracy, as I suggested, was growing, and in a necessary way. You have a very the NRC committees did coordination, and coordination is a very different thing from management. So there's a real move to do administration. In addition, there were lawyers involved who wanted to track the money, as they do in any large-scale expenditure of government money. And as I said, you really needed, once it got to a certain point, an informal network was not sufficient to support this research infrastructure. It needed administration. And this is just, again, just to show you the changing values. This is another Clark quote. Administration, federal money, and the National Defense Research Committee, which eventually took control of the whole program. This is another long quote. You don't have to read this one either, but I'm not going to highlight anything. The point of this is, one of the things I find interesting is, this was kaleidoscopic, the organizational things and the control issues. So you might sit down one day with a colleague and not know whether he's wearing his I'm a federal bureaucrat hat, or he's wearing his I'm a university professor and your colleague at the ACS hat. And many times, what Irwin's point is here, it didn't really matter. People involved in this didn't know or didn't care, but somebody needed to know and somebody needed to care, because you had to maintain the infrastructure, you had to pay the bills, and you had to make sure who owned what. Okay, moving on to its accomplishments. They screened more than 14,000 compounds for antimalarial activity. They set up atabrine as a very effective prophylactic and treatment drug, given the times and given the emergency. An enormous amount of this drug was produced and used in the armed forces. And by the end of the war, chloroquine, remember I mentioned that at the end of the interwar section, chloroquine was identified as a superior compound. And that's kind of an odd thing for a big research program like this, that one of its major accomplishments is to identify not just a compound that's known, but a compound that was deliberately produced for an earlier antimalarial program as the drug of choice. But that is what emerged from this. And this really is one of the miracle drugs to come out of World War II. Very low side effects, very effective drug, used in enormous quantities around the world for many years, but used alone and used in enormous quantities. And so over time, resistance developed in the parasites. And so what was once a very sharp tool is now, in most parts of the world, entirely useless as a drug. Now this claim here that World War II was the first major U.S. conflict in which fewer U.S. soldiers died of disease than combat injuries is not entirely attributable, obviously, to antimalarial issues, but that is part of it. So this was a very modern war in that sense, that the medical advances in blood transfusion and penicillin and so on, and antimalarials, made it a modern war in that enemy action was the major killer. Again here, this is only partly antimalarials, but I kind of like this bar graph. The background bars are for World War I, and the foreground is World War II, year by year, and this was within the continental United States, the number of cases of malaria. And they did a great job of controlling malaria through many different ways, at least in part with drugs, in the Continental Army. Now, the bigger questions of what was the impact, what's the legacy of this program to biomedicine? Again, organization, scale, and communication. Biomedicine had not been done in so many different places on a single topic at such a scale in such a time period ever before. Communication was enormously important. The survey of antimalarial drugs, which I talk about in the book, but which I haven't talked about here, was very important. They took over the reading room at the library at Johns Hopkins Medical School, and from that room they distributed compounds would come in and they would be sent out for testing. Requests for information would come in and go out, and they controlled all that confidential matter very carefully, tailoring the reports appropriately so that people had the data they needed, but that they weren't giving away the intellectual property of their contributors. So that communication became very important, and it was all done on paper and cards. There were not computers in this program. What changed during the war? Well, the scale of research money, especially federal research money, grew enormously. This takes you through 44, but it's a nice graphic of just the scale at which, the speed at which federal R&D ramped up. There's the War Department, which is the Army, the Navy, OSRD, and then less and less. NACA is one of NASA's predecessors. Now, there's no data in the foreground of this, but what it points out is that not only was wartime government R&D money enormous compared to pre-war government R&D money, it was enormous compared to all pre-war R&D. So you see industry and the nonprofit area, that would be people like the Rockefeller Foundation, it dwarfed all of that. And that's definitely something that you see in the post-war period where, especially in biomedicine, the federal government becomes the big funder. It also shaped the way post-war research was done. You wouldn't have a biochemistry program, you'd have a disease-based program, interdisciplinary. You'd have a larger scale of things. Trial and error was a respected basis. As I said before, they didn't understand the mechanism of action of those drugs, but they were still able to do rational drug development. You would do both fundamental and applied research at the same time. You would have goal-oriented research. And innovations in both how you would network all these bits together and the communication that was entailed in that. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of that, first with the National Institutes of Health, then specifically with the National Cancer Institute, which is what I'm going to close on. And I want to mention the pharmaceutical industry. I don't have good sources for the pharmaceutical industry, but from an impressionistic standpoint, if you look at the growth and nature of pharmaceutical research in the post-war period in America, it grew enormously, and it produced a lot of successful drugs. And much of that was modeled on this same sort of random screening, large-scale, multi-center approach to drug discovery. So the National Institutes of Health, remember Jim Shannon, I mentioned him earlier. He was the guy that headed up the clinical work for the antimalarial program. After the war, he came to NIH first in 1948 as director of the new National Heart Institute, promoted to associate director of the NIH, and finally director of the NIH. And he is arguably the important director of the post-war NIH. He had a great relationship with Congress. He pulled a lot of money in. He grew both in the total size and in the number of institutes and centers that was the NIH. And the two guys who brought him in, who were the #1 and #2 guys at NIH at the time he was hired, Rolla Dyer and Norm Topping, both guys with backgrounds in infectious disease who were very much aware of what he had done during the war. This is from an oral history with Shannon that's up at the National Library of Medicine. Dyer and Topping knew that the wartime enterprises had been outstandingly successful despite the complexity and breadth of the program. They felt that the Goldwater enterprises, Shannon had conducted his own research and worked at Goldwater Memorial Hospital in New York during the war, which were sprung up and were developed in a very short period of time, was precisely the thing they wanted done at the new NIH, the post-war NIH. So his claim is they were deliberately bringing him in to institute exactly that kind of research program. This is an earlier comment, but about a later period from Shannon from 1965 about the industrial approach, which I would say is equivalent to the trial and error as a sound basis of research. The industrial approach was one in which one undertook the search for therapeutic agents without first fully understanding, and these are Shannon's words, the mechanisms we are trying to interfere with. This approach had yielded, and these are his examples, the antibiotics, the antihistamines, the blood pressure agents, and the tranquilizers, all products of industrial style and indeed partly out of the pharmaceutical industry research in the post-war period. So that model was very fruitful in the 50s, 60s, and 70s for how you would go about conducting biomedical research. And as I said, I just want to close with a couple of comments about National Cancer Institute. I just like this illustration because it's very much like that very simplified post-war flow chart of how the panels and committees of Division 6 worked, and here they're cogs, but you have the committees, you have the outside agencies, and so on. But this one I like even better. I think you can see that. Borrowing networks of innovation from Lou Galambos. What you see here is NCI's post-war anti-cancer drug screening program outlined, and it's exactly what you had in the malaria program. You have compounds coming in from the government, from industry, from universities, from research organizations, all this stuff coming together to a central clearinghouse that's passed along into animal screens and other clinical testing. Where appropriate, it goes to the clinic, and where appropriate, it goes to the patients at the very end, released to practicing physicians, and the feedback loops of information and data. Very much modeled on what happened in the malaria program, and indeed the early leaders of NCI, post-war leaders, were also veterans, in particular of Shannon's lab, but also of the program in general. So I'm just going to wrap it up there. I think that suggests that this might have been an important program for 20th century biomedicine. And I want to thank the folks at Hopkins and at the Max Planck and at the Chemical Heritage Foundation for funding my research. And I'll close with this picture. I don't know if we have dust jackets on the books outside. This was designed to motivate people to take their Atabrine, which was not a particularly enjoyable drug, but an effective one, good enough. And I borrowed that for my book cover. Thank you very much. Do you want me to take my own questions? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you very much. If you have any questions, you can just.
Yes.
You touched on the most important development of all, right there, when they developed coated Atabrine. If you had the early uncoated Atabrine, you had to get your cup of water handy and psych yourself up and get the pill and get it down as fast as possible past your throat. Otherwise, you taste that acrid taste for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, they did have a lot of problems with compliance there, yeah.
That was Townsville, Australia.
I didn't mention the Australians, but they did a lot of clinical research in this. In the back?
Was this medication administered through pills, or was it?
It was oral, pills. Yeah.
This is a related topic, but have you done any research on the yellow fever vaccine that they were in a hurry to develop for the soldiers in World War II, in which sickened 50,000 troops because they used a few in control, left them with hepatitis B for the rest of their lives?
No, I've not done work on that. Next book.
It's really interesting that hardly anybody knows about that, but my dad was one of them, and he suffered all his life.
There were people in the malaria clinical research who were given malaria by blood transfusion, who some of whom got hepatitis, and that sort of research went on until the 70s in prison populations. So there is a big history of it. Yes.
But isn't it true that when we talk about a prophylactic and so on, the implication is that having taken these drugs, you will not get malaria. But when you got malaria, you had it for the rest of your life. It didn't kill you, but it came back and back and back and back.
Well, with Vivax, that's a real issue. But some of the there are some drugs developed that I didn't talk about, that Primaquine among them, that can help address that issue. But that was another issue. People returning, veterans who had Vivax, their recurrences were covered. The Veterans Administration would take care of you. There was a lot of back and forth about what to do with the research subjects who might suffer recurrence, that is, prisoners, conscientious objectors, other people, and who would pay for that. And I think in the end they did get their malaria treatment covered, but I never quite was able to pin that down. Yes, and then the back.
It's very much a very informative presentation. And I'd like to, if you have some words to say about the Bayer IG Farben project, what it was, and a little more about how it related to the malarial research.
It was the first successful synthetic antimalarial program. So it was a model for a lot of people in the 30s. Already, you know, as soon as they got plasmachin, people really started to notice this. A lot of people tried to take up this. First, it was in canaries with bird malaria, and during the 20s and 30s, people collected a lot of different avian malarias and looked for better hosts. So, you know, at Hopkins, as Karen knows, at Hopkins during the war, they had a lot of ducks and chickens with a couple of different parasites there. So it was very much a resource for that. The British borrowed from it. During the war itself, the folks at Bayer quickly found themselves with very few resources, and by the end they were, you know, spend most of their time growing their own food. So they really didn't have the push. But they did, the Germans did develop Santochin, which was closely related to chloroquine, and it was the capture of that German drug in North Africa that led them to re-examine and find chloroquine. So the German program was very influential, and perhaps they were lucky, or maybe they were good, but they really laid out a lot of the basic planks of that sort of research.
Did you use our OSRD collection?
I have not used your OSRD collection. I used the one at Penn. I used the one at NARA.
Well, a lot of it was republished anyways, but I mean, there could be some really interesting science. There are some, you know, they did after the war, they were not republished.
Lots of
Yeah, there was a lot of, because of the confidentiality issue, there's a lot of publications of the research that was conducted. You weren't allowed to publish it during the war, but after the war, a lot of it came out. And they also published the survey of antimalarial drugs in a couple of volumes to just summarize all the compounds and all the data, because they didn't feel that a journal could handle all of that.
Aside from the OSRD technical reports, are there Bayer documents in the early PD collection? And then we went in and captured.
I don't know what there's a few reports in the OSRD stuff of the kinds of surveys. You know, there were a lot of scientists sent into Germany right behind the lines to collect information. You know, most famously probably the rocket program and Werner von Braun. But there's material in there about what work they did during the war, and that's where I know that they didn't get much done because of a lack of resources. That's the source for that. What was the first part of your question? I had something else I was going to say. I did go to Bayer. They do have some of their records. They have research reports. I mean, like, it was fascinating. Like, for the atabrine, the chemist who synthesized it submits a report. He's got the structures, he's got his methods, and of course, since he's a dye chemist, working in the dye program, although he's making this for antimalarial testing, the back page has tassels of different fibers dyed with atabrine to show you it's different, you know, on silk, on wool, on cotton. So they were really, he was working in the pharmaceutical program there, but they were really a dye group, the chemists were. They had very nice records. They had an American a subsidiary which sold these drugs in the U.S., and they had all of those records preserved of the back and forth letters with the home office. So there's a lot of nice material, some of which I managed to shoehorn into the book, about the use and developing the use of those drugs in the interwar period here. How do we convince doctors to use them? How do we get the state public health office to buy our drugs and use for malaria control and so on? So that all that stuff is in Germany, and they have a lovely archive, and I only broke their copy machine once.
Why was the chloroquine research originally discontinued?
They had sent it up to, I guess their collaborator was up in Hamburg, and he put it into a few patients, and evidently it seemed to make them ill, so they dropped it. It was done on a very small scale, so it's hard to tell, and it was generally done, there's a big piece of this that has to do with mental institutions and the treatment of paralytics with syphilis, with malaria therapy, and then using the drugs to terminate their malaria therapy. It's a somewhat controversial and fairly complicated thing. But because they were sending the drugs to asylums, the doctors there often did the toxicology on other very ill patients there. So that would probably explain their bad data, but also it's a rather, what we would consider today to be extremely unethical, or criminal even.
So, for your presentation, I'm just curious, is chloroquine still being used now in the U.S. or in any other part of the world?
I think it is being used. I traveled someplace once, and they said, oh, if you stay in the west of the country and don't go east of these mountains, you can still use chloroquine. So there are still parasite populations that are sensitive to it, so it is still out there.
I have a question. So how's the dynamic changed for the American malaria scientists before the war ended and then post-war and present? Because it's not as relevant.
Well, across the war, one of the things you see happen after the war is penicillin's there, chloroquine's there, there's lots of DDT is there for anything with that has an insect vector. And although a lot of research was done on infectious disease pre-war, there's a couple of major reports in the post-war period that say, well, these are not really the diseases of our population, and they start to, the diseases we all think of as being very important, take the fore in research. That's why they set up the Heart Institute, for example. They realized that long-term, that stroke, cardiac disease, cancer, all these things that we view, the diseases of the rich were really becoming the major causes of mortality and morbidity in the United States, and they really shifted the emphasis away from infectious disease. So for a long time, malaria was a disease of poor people in another place, and it really was not looked at. And it's only in the last couple of decades, largely through the efforts of private philanthropy, that it's been raised up and people have become aware of it again. I think partly on the heels of the political consciousness raising with HIV, and partly just, it was such a big thing, it was sort of horrific that no one was paying attention to it for so long.
So if there is no other questions, please join me for thanks again for the speakers. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.